The sun hung lazily in the sky as James Mitchell wiped the sweat off his brow. Owning a large estate on the outskirts of town had its perks: peace, privacy, and most importantly, his very own private tennis court. It wasn't just any court. It was a pristine, professional-grade setup, something he had built for his own enjoyment. But that peace was about to be shattered. James had lived in the neighborhood for years, keeping to himself. He wasn't part of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and had no intention of joining. But that never stopped Linda Peterson, self-appointed queen of the HOA, from trying to control everything. She was the kind of woman who believed rules only applied to others, wielding her clipboard like a scepter, terrorizing anyone who didn't conform to her version of community standards. One afternoon, as James sat on his porch sipping iced tea, he noticed a group of strangers casually strolling onto his property. Dressed in tennis gear, they carried rackets, laughing as they approached his private court. Confused, James set down his glass and walked over. "Excuse me," he said, hands on his hips. "Can I help you?" A smug-looking man turned and blinked at him. "Oh, Linda told us this court was available for HOA members. She said the HOA maintains it, so it's a community amenity now." James felt a slow, burning anger rise in his chest. "Linda told you that, did she?" he said, forcing a smile. "Yes," another woman chimed in. "She said you had agreed." James let out a short laugh. "That's interesting, because I own this court, and I've never agreed to anything." The group exchanged awkward glances. "Well, Linda said." James cut them off. "I don't care what Linda said. This is private property. You're trespassing." The players mumbled apologies and quickly gathered their things. But James wasn't done. He stormed over to the HOA office, a small but annoyingly official-looking building at the edge of the neighborhood. He pushed open the door, and there she was, Linda Peterson, seated behind a desk, looking as smug as ever. "James," she said with an exaggerated smile, "what brings you here?" James crossed his arms. "Care to explain why people are using my private tennis court?" Linda gave a dismissive wave. "Oh, that. Well, since you never use it all the time, the HOA decided it would be better if the community had access. It's only fair." James clenched his jaw. "Fair? You're giving away something that doesn't belong to you." Linda sighed dramatically. "James, it's just tennis. Be neighborly." James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know what? I'll handle this another way." Linda smirked. "Do what you want. The HOA rules are the HOA rules." James walked out, but inside a plan was already forming. Linda had made a big mistake, and soon she'd learn exactly how wrong she was. James spent the evening packing his living room, fuming at Linda's audacity. She had always been a nuisance, but this was a new level of entitlement. Deciding that the best way to handle this was through legal means, he called his lawyer first thing in the morning. "Let me get this straight," his lawyer, Mark, said, barely suppressing a chuckle. "The HOA just decided your private tennis court belongs to them." "That's exactly what happened," James grumbled. "Can they do that?" "Absolutely not," Mark assured him. "But knowing these HOA types, they'll try to weasel around the law. I suggest sending a formal cease and desist letter immediately." James smirked. "Perfect, let's do it." Later that afternoon, James personally delivered the letter to Linda's office. She barely glanced at the envelope before tossing it into a drawer. "Oh, James, always so dramatic," she said, smiling sweetly. "You're wasting time. The HOA has decided." James clenched his fists. "That's not how ownership works, Linda. This is illegal." She leaned back in her chair. "It's a gray area, and honestly, who's going to fight me on it? The community supports this." James stared at her, realizing exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. Linda wasn't just an annoying busybody. She was a power-hungry control freak who believed she was untouchable. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "We'll see about that," he said before walking out. The next morning, James woke up to find dozens of people on his property, playing on his court, drinking lemonade on his patio furniture, and treating his land like it was a public park. His blood boiled. Linda had doubled down. A few minutes later, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Linda standing there, smug as ever. "You're causing quite a stir, James," she said, feigning innocence. "People are just trying to have fun." "You have 1 hour to get everyone off my property," he said through gritted teeth. Linda chuckled. "Oh, James, you're taking this so personally. It's just a tennis court." James took a deep breath, his mind already working. He was done arguing. It was time to show Linda exactly who she was messing with. And as fate would have it, he was about to get the perfect opportunity. James had dealt with difficult people before, but Linda was on another level. She wasn't just stealing his property, she was acting as if she had every right to do so. That smug look on her face, the way she dismissed him like he was nothing more than a nuisance, it made his blood boil. But James wasn't a man who lost his temper. No, he was a man who planned. That evening, he dug through his files, checking every legal document related to his property. The tennis court had been built long before the HOA was even formed, meaning they had absolutely zero claim to it. But he needed something bigger, something that would force Linda to regret ever crossing him. And then, as if the universe had delivered it straight into his lap, James received an email that changed everything. The subject line read, "Auditor Appointment Confirmation, Office of State Housing and HOA Affairs." His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, this letter confirms your recent appointment as a state auditor for HOA compliance and financial practices. Your assigned cases will be provided within the next week. We appreciate your service in ensuring transparency and lawful operations within homeowners associations. Sincerely, Office of State Housing and HOA Affairs." James stared at the screen, then let out a slow, satisfied laugh. Linda had no idea. Not only was he about to get his court back, but he now had government authority to investigate HOA financials, rule enforcement, and potential corruption. And knowing Linda, there was no way she had been running the HOA by the book. The next morning, he drove to the HOA office, feeling a new kind of confidence. When he walked in, Linda was seated at her desk, casually sipping coffee. "James, if you're here to complain about the tennis court again." James smiled. "Actually, I'm here on official business." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Official?" James pulled a neatly folded letter from his pocket and slid it across her desk. Linda frowned as she picked it up, her eyes scanning the document. Within seconds, her face went pale. You're an auditor," she stammered. James leaned forward slightly. "That's right. And guess which HOA just got assigned for a full compliance audit?" Linda's coffee cup trembled in her hand. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I am," James said smoothly. "And Linda, I really hope your books are in order." For the first time since this nightmare started, Linda wasn't smiling anymore. Linda's face drained of color as she clutched the letter in her trembling hands. Her usual smugness had been replaced with something James had never seen before: fear. This must be a mistake," she stammered. "You can't audit us." James crossed his arms, enjoying the rare moment of watching her squirm. "Oh, but I can. See, Linda, your little HOA falls under state housing regulations. And as a newly appointed state auditor, I have full authority to review your financials, rule enforcement, and governance." Linda let out a nervous chuckle, trying to regain her composure. "James, let's be reasonable. This is just a misunderstanding. We're all neighbors here." James smirked. "Funny, you didn't care about being reasonable when you stole my tennis court, but don't worry, I'll be thorough." She swallowed hard. "You're doing this out of spite." "No, Linda, I'm doing this because the law requires HOA boards to be transparent. If everything's in order, you have nothing to worry about. But if there's anything shady going on..." He let the sentence hang, watching her fidget uncomfortably. Linda's usual arrogance had completely vanished. Her fingers drummed anxiously against her desk. "James, maybe we can work something out." He raised an eyebrow. "Work something out? You mean like how you worked it out when you illegally let people trespass on my property?" She forced a smile. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot. I'll tell everyone to stop using the tennis court. No harm done. James chuckled. Oh, Linda, this stopped being about the tennis court the second you thought you were above the law. Linda shifted in her chair. What exactly does an audit involve? James leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to let the tension sink in. Oh, just a full review of the HOA's financial records, spending reports, board meeting minutes, and any complaints filed against you. You know, the usual. Linda's breath hitched. Complaints. James nodded. I wonder what I'll find. For the first time, Linda looked genuinely terrified. James had a strong feeling this HOA was hiding something, and he was going to tear it apart, piece by piece. Better start getting those books in order, he said, flashing a grin. I'll be seeing a lot more of you soon. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Linda stunned in silence. James drove home with a satisfied grin on his face. For the first time since this whole mess started, he was in control. He had spent years dealing with HOA nonsense, but now he had legal power to expose every shady thing Linda had done. And he had no doubt there was plenty to uncover. Once home, he pulled out his laptop and began researching. If Linda was willing to steal his private tennis court, what else had she done? It didn't take long before he started finding interesting things. First, there were multiple complaints from residents about mysterious HOA fees increasing without explanation. People had been forced to pay for repairs that never happened, community improvements that didn't exist, and fines for ridiculous infractions like grass growing too fast. Then he found something even better, a contractor fraud case linked to the HOA. Linda had hired her own nephew's company to do overpriced maintenance work, even though the guy had zero experience. James smirked. Oh, this was going to be fun. The next morning, he walked into the HOA office unannounced, a folder full of documents under his arm. Linda was already there, looking frazzled. James, she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile, I wasn't expecting you today. He casually set the folder down on her desk. Just getting started with the audit. Figured I'd stop by and let you know what I'm looking into first. Linda's eyes flicked to the folder. That won't be necessary. I can just send you some reports. James chuckled. Oh, I'm sure you can, but I prefer to see the real ones. She swallowed. Of course, everything is completely above board. James leaned in slightly. Great, then you won't mind explaining these missing funds from the HOA account. Linda's face went pale. What? James flipped open the folder, tapping a highlighted section. See, according to your records, the HOA collected over $50,000 in community improvement fees, but there's no record of where that money actually went. Linda froze. James smiled. So, Linda, where's the money? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead. Take your time, James said. I'll be conducting a full review. If I find any signs of fraud, I'll have to report it to the State Housing Board and, of course, the authorities. Linda gasped, You wouldn't. James tilted his head. Wouldn't I? For the first time since this started, Linda looked trapped. James sat back, watching her squirm. Oh, she was going to pay for this, and he was just getting started. Linda's hands were visibly shaking as she flipped through the audit documents. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced with sheer panic. James, she said, forcing a nervous chuckle, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for whatever misunderstanding this is. James smirked. Oh, I'm sure there is. That's why I'll be going through every single receipt, invoice, and bank transaction under this HOA's name. You wouldn't mind that, right? Linda swallowed hard. James, maybe we should just... Before she could finish, the door to the HOA office burst open. Linda, a frustrated voice snapped. A man in a polo shirt stormed in, holding a red notice in his hand. I just got fined $500 for excessive bird feeders. What the hell is that? Linda's face twitched. Mr. Caldwell, this is an official HOA ruling. Official, Caldwell scoffed. You're just making up fines at this point, and I'm not the only one. Half the neighborhood is talking about this. James leaned back in his chair, enjoying the show. Wow, Linda, it almost sounds like you've been running a little financial scam. Linda shot him a deadly glare, but her panic was growing. Caldwell slammed the notice onto her desk. This is theft. I want to see the HOA financials now. James cleared his throat. Actually, I have them right here. He held up the audit folder. And guess what? There's about $50,000 missing. Caldwell's eyes widened. 50 grand. Linda let out a nervous laugh. That's ridiculous. James is just misinterpreting the records. James grinned. Oh, I don't think so, and neither will the State Housing Board once I send them my report. But hey, Linda, if you'd rather explain this to a judge instead. Linda gasped, a judge. Caldwell's face darkened. You've been stealing from us, haven't you? James shrugged. Oh, and let's not forget the contractor fraud. You wouldn't happen to know why HOA money was used to pay your nephew's company, would you? Linda looked like she was about to faint. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. James leaned forward. You know, Linda, if I were you, I'd start cooperating before this turns into a criminal investigation. Silence. Then Linda suddenly lunged for the audit folder. James was faster. He snatched it back before she could touch it. Tusk, he teased. Tampering with an official audit, that's another violation. Linda collapsed into her chair, her face ashen. She had finally realized the truth. She was screwed. James stood up, satisfied. I'll be submitting my findings to the board and the state this week. Oh, and Linda, he smirked. I'm getting my damn tennis court back. Linda just sat there, stunned. And James? James walked out, feeling like a king. The fallout from the audit hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. Within days, James' findings had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents were furious. They had long suspected shady dealings, but now they had proof, thanks to James. Linda, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, was now the most hated woman in the community. It all came crashing down at the next emergency HOA meeting, which was packed with angry homeowners demanding answers. James sat comfortably near the front, watching as Linda squirmed in her chair. $50,000, Mr. Caldwell bellowed. Where is it, Linda? Linda's face was red and blotchy. I was going to allocate the funds for future projects, she stammered. A woman in the crowd scoffed. Oh, really? Then why did the HOA pay your nephew's company for repairs that never happened? Murmurs of outrage filled the room. Linda was trapped and she knew it. James decided to twist the knife. He stood up and cleared his throat. Actually, Linda, you'll have to answer to more than just us. Since my audit uncovered financial fraud, the State Housing Board has been notified. And well, he smirked, they're very interested in your management style. Linda froze. You reported me, she squeaked. James crossed his arms. Linda, sweetheart, it's my job. The room exploded in cheers and laughter. Linda panicked. She scrambled to grab her papers, knocking over her water bottle in the process. This is unfair. I was just trying to improve the community. By stealing from us, someone shouted. Linda's usual confidence crumbled. I need a lawyer, she muttered under her breath. James grinned. Oh, you'll definitely need one. With the entire room turned against her, Linda had no choice. The HOA board voted to remove her on the spot. She had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, but now she was just another disgraced fraudster, left humiliated in front of everyone she once controlled. As James walked out, he couldn't help but enjoy the poetic justice. And the best part, his tennis court was his again, forever. A week after Linda's downfall, James sat on his porch, sipping a cold drink and watching his freshly vacant tennis court. No more trespassers, no more HOA nonsense, just peace. Linda, on the other hand, was in deep trouble. The State Housing Board had launched an official fraud investigation, and the missing HOA funds were being traced. Homeowners were demanding she pay back every stolen dollar. The community that once feared her now treated her like a pariah. Neighbors ignored her. Doors were slammed in her face, and whispers followed her everywhere. James had heard that she tried to plead her case, but it was too late. The HOA board had voted her out, her assets were being audited, and legal action was almost certain. As for the HOA itself, without Linda's iron grip, things started improving immediately. The ridiculous fines were revoked, shady contracts were investigated, and new board members, actual honest people, were elected. One afternoon, as James was getting ready to play a game of tennis with a friend, a familiar, pitiful figure appeared at the edge of his property. Linda. She looked wrecked, her once perfect hair was a mess, and the smugness she used to wear like armor was gone. James raised an eyebrow. "Linda, what a surprise." She swallowed hard. "James, I just wanted to say, I might have overstepped." James let out a short laugh. "Overstepped? Linda, you tried to steal my property and got caught committing fraud. That's more than overstepping." She winced. "I lost everything. My position, my reputation, even my friends." James sipped his drink. "Ah, yes, actions do have consequences." Linda sighed heavily. I thought maybe we could put this behind us." James leaned on his tennis racket, smirking. "You mean like how you put behind the fact that you stole from the entire community?" She looked away, shame finally settling in. I didn't think I'd get caught." James chuckled. "Well, Linda, that's the thing about audits, they bring out the truth." Linda stood there awkwardly for a moment, but James had nothing more to say. She had dug her own grave, and now she had to lie in it. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her reign of terror officially over. James watched her go, then turned back to his court with a satisfied sigh. He bounced the tennis ball once, then served it across the net, enjoying the sweet sound of victory. Justice had been served, and he didn't even break a sweat.